I was fixing the broken latch on the barn door when my son-in-law walked up behind me and said, loud enough for everyone on the porch to hear, "Someone call the handyman. At least he's useful for something." He laughed at his own joke. My daughter laughed too. Just a little, nervous and quick, the way she always did when she didn't know what else to do. Neither of them knew that the barn, the farmhouse behind it, the 212 acres of Virginia hill country surrounding us, and the winery producing 40,000 cases a year, all of it belonged to me. Before I tell you what happened next, let me start from the beginning. My name is Raymond. I'm 63 years old. I have calluses on my hands from decades of real work, a closet full of flannel shirts, and a pickup truck with 200,000 miles on it that I have no intention of replacing. My late wife Patricia used to say I dressed like a man who'd never heard of a mirror. She meant it with love. I miss her every single day. The property has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather bought the land in the 1890s, cleared the fields himself, built the original farmhouse with timber cut from the property. My grandfather added the barn and the first apple orchards. My father converted a corner of those orchards into a small vineyard in the 1970s, mostly as a hobby. A few rows of Cabernet Franc and Chardonnay he tended on weekends. When I took over the land at 31 after he passed, I had 2 things, the land and a clear vision. 20 years later, Hollow Creek Vineyard was producing award-winning wines sold in 42 states. I'd built a tasting room, a small inn, a farm-to-table restaurant that had a 6-week waiting list on weekends. I had done all of it without borrowing a cent after the first 5 years. But I still drove the same style of truck my father drove. Still wore the same flannel. Still walked the rows myself every morning before breakfast, checking the vines the way my grandfather taught me. I didn't need people to know what I had. The land knew. The work knew. That was enough. My daughter Claire was 32 when this happened. She'd grown up on the property, learned to drive in the south pasture, had her first glass of wine at the table with Patricia and me when she turned 21. She'd been a sweet, curious kid who loved the vineyard, who used to follow me down the rows asking questions about fermentation and soil chemistry that most adults couldn't answer. Somewhere in her late 20s, after she met her husband Preston, that version of her started to fade. He didn't replace it with something better. Preston was 35, owned a small commercial real estate brokerage in Arlington, drove a leased BMW, and wore the kind of clothes that made clear he thought about clothes. He wasn't evil, I want to be fair about that, but he was the sort of man who measured other men by the size of their office, the model of their car, the label on their jacket. He'd grown up in a household where appearances were currency, and he'd never questioned whether that was a reasonable way to move through the world. He spoke in a tone that carried a low-level condescension, the way some people carry a scent, present always, noticeable once you'd registered it, impossible to ignore after that. He called me Ray, not Dad, not Raymond, Ray, with a slight emphasis, as if the informality was a downgrade he was generously offering. Patricia had never warmed to him. She'd said so quietly one evening, sitting on the back porch watching the fireflies come up from the east field. "He doesn't see you," she said. "He sees what he's decided you are." She died 14 months later, a stroke, quick and without warning, the worst morning of my life. I'd been planning to invite Preston and Claire out to the property that summer for a proper family trip, to show them the expansion we'd done on the inn, to sit at that table and finally tell Claire the full scope of what we'd built. I'd wanted Patricia there when I did it. After she was gone, I kept putting it off. 2 years passed. Preston's brokerage had a difficult run. Claire mentioned once, carefully, that they were watching their budget, that the market had been hard. I sent money without being asked, a transfer for $40,000, enough to cover what I understood was the gap in their quarterly shortfall. Preston thanked me in a 3-line email. Claire called and cried and said she didn't know how to repay me. I told her it wasn't a loan. I'd done the same for my sister's family years before, for different reasons. Money was not something I thought about the way some people do. This past October, I decided it was time. The fall harvest at Hollow Creek is the finest thing I know. The air sharp with the smell of crushed grapes, the hills going gold and amber, the whole property at its most alive. I invited Claire and Preston for a long weekend. I told them the property had a small inn and they'd be staying there, that I wanted them to see the place before the season ended. I did not tell them it was mine. I staged it the way I'd planned it, with Patricia in mind. Present it as a getaway first, let them experience it naturally, then reveal the truth over dinner on the last night, the way you'd wait until the end of a good meal to bring out the dessert that changes the whole memory of the evening. They arrived on a Friday afternoon. Preston stepped out of his BMW, looked at the farmhouse, looked at the barn, looked at the rolling hills beyond the fence line and said, "Not bad for a country inn. What does a place like this run per night?" I told him I'd arranged a complimentary stay through a contact I had. He nodded the way people nod when they're cataloguing information rather than receiving it. Claire hugged me and said it was beautiful. She meant it. For a moment she looked like herself, like the girl who used to run barefoot through the rows. I gave them the tour. The tasting room, the fermentation building, the inn's common room with the stone fireplace and the antique bar my grandfather had built in 1943. Preston asked at each stop, who owned the place? I said the family that had run it for generations preferred to stay private. He seemed to accept this. He was more interested in appraising the value of things than in knowing who held the title. At dinner that evening, the restaurant served our reserve Chardonnay with the first course. Preston swirled it, tasted it and said it was decent, better than he expected from a Virginia winery. "These small regional labels are hit or miss," he said, holding the glass up to the candlelight. "You can't really compare them to Napa, but for the price point, I suppose it works." The sommelier, a young woman named Jessie who'd worked for me for 6 years, caught my eye from across the room. I gave the smallest possible shake of my head. She set the bottle down and walked away without a word. Saturday morning, I was out at the barn early, repairing a section of the fence line that one of the equipment trailers had clipped the week before. I was on my knees in the dirt with a post driver and a length of wire when Claire and Preston came out after breakfast. Claire asked if she could help. Preston watched. "Ray," he said after a moment, hands in his pockets, "you really don't have to do manual labour on your vacation. I'm sure the property has staff for this." "I like doing it," I said, which was true. He smiled at Claire. "Old habits." Then, louder in the direction of the main barn where 2 of my crew were loading crates, "Hey, is there a maintenance guy on property? This fence needs proper repair." He said it the way people say things they expect to be acted on. One of my crew, a man named Glenn, who'd been with me for 11 years, looked over. Glenn looked at me. I shook my head slightly. Glenn went back to his crates. Preston turned back to me. "These country places always look charming in the photos," he said, "but the upkeep costs must be brutal. Whoever owns this is probably bleeding cash. Old barns, old buildings. Beautiful, sure, but from a real estate perspective, sentimental assets are almost always underperforming assets." He said this with the comfortable authority of someone who believed he was offering valuable insight. "I've looked at properties like this. They're usually family situations. Someone inherited land they don't know how to monetize, holding on for emotional reasons. That's the story with most of these old farm estates." Claire said nothing. She was looking at the fence line, or pretending to. I finished the repair, stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans. "Probably right," I said. Preston clapped me on the shoulder. "Come on, Ray. Let the staff handle this stuff. You're supposed to be relaxing." He said it with genuine friendliness, which somehow made it worse. He wasn't being cruel. He had simply decided, completely and without doubt, that I was a man of modest means on a comfortable weekend, and that this conclusion required no further examination. That afternoon I was in the tasting room when the incident happened. I was showing Claire the reserve collection, bottles we kept behind the bar, not for general sale, the limited runs from exceptional years. She was asking about the 2009-19 Petit Verdot, which had won a double gold at the San Francisco Chronicle wine competition that year when Preston came in from the outdoor terrace. He'd been on his phone for most of the afternoon, working calls, pacing the flagstone. He looked irritated. He set his phone on the bar, looked at the bottles behind me and said, "While we're in here, any chance I can get a taste of something better than what they served last night? I know wineries like this. Keep the good stuff for the winery tours. The house pour they gave us was fine for a weeknight, but I know there's a reserve tier." I reached for the 2019 Petit Verdot and poured him a glass. He tasted it. His expression shifted. genuinely surprised, recalibrating. "Okay," he said, "that's actually very good. What does this retail for?" $20, I said. He looked at the glass differently. "Not bad for Virginia." He poured himself a second taste without asking, the way people do when they've reclassified something as worthy of their attention. Then he set the glass down, looked at the display panel on the wall, framed awards, magazine covers, competition medals, and said, "Hollow Creek. Huh, never heard of it. What's the production volume?" "This looks like maybe a boutique operation." He gestured at the medals. "Nice trophies, but in the real wine world, you need distribution and volume. Regional prestige is fine for the locals, but it doesn't move the needle nationally." Jessie was behind the bar restocking. Her jaw tightened visibly. Claire had gone quiet in that particular way that told me she disagreed with her husband, but had decided this wasn't the hill she wanted to die on. I said, "I think the distribution has done pretty well." Then I excused myself to take a call. The call was from my operations manager, going over the Q4 numbers. 41,200 cases projected for the year. Hospitality revenue up 18%. The restaurant had been approached again by a food publication for a feature. I stood in the small office behind the tasting room and listened, took notes on a notepad, and did not feel like a man bleeding cash on a sentimental asset. When I came back out, Preston was telling Claire that they should look at buying a property like this someday as an investment, something with a working agricultural component, good tax treatment. And if you run it right, you can flip it for a significant multiple when land values go up. He was looking at the vineyard through the window the way he had looked at everything all weekend, the way a man looks at something he has already decided he understands. That evening was when things shifted. After dinner I suggested a walk down to the lower terrace, which overlooks the eastern rows at dusk. It's the finest view on the property. Patricia had loved it. I'd scattered some of her ashes there in the second row of the Chardonnay block without telling anyone. Preston stopped at the stone railing, looked out and said, "I'll say this. Whoever owns this place, they got lucky with the land. This view alone is worth something, but they're leaving money on the table. This terrace should be an event venue. I run revenue projections in my sleep and I can tell you, a property like this running private events could generate 2-3 times what a tasting room pulls. Weddings alone. Destination weddings in Virginia wine country are massive right now. I've got clients who'd pay serious money for a venue like this." He looked at me directly. "You know the owners personally. Since you got us the comp'd stay, may be worth putting them in touch with me. I could consult on the hospitality strategy, obviously on a fee basis." I looked at him for a moment, at Claire, who was watching the last of the light leave the eastern hills. "We already run events," I said. "The wedding program alone did $412,000 last year. We're booked through next October." Preston paused. "The inn told you that?" "No," I said. "I know it because I run the books." The stillness that followed was the kind that happens when something in the atmosphere has changed and nobody's quite registered what it was yet. "You work here?" Preston said, recalibrating into what he thought was a new box. "Local employee, bookkeeper, long-time staff." "I own it," I said. Claire turned from the railing. I looked at my daughter and said it the way I should have said it years ago, clearly and without theatre. "Hollow Creek has been in our family for 4 generations. I converted it from an orchard to a working vineyard in 1994. Patricia and I built everything you've seen this weekend. The farmhouse, the barn, the tasting room, the inn, the restaurant, all of it. The 212 acres. The 212 acres. The label. The distribution in 42 states. All of it belongs to me, and when I'm gone, it belongs to you." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Claire's hand went to her mouth. Preston had gone completely still, the way men go still when they're running a calculation that keeps returning the wrong answer. "That's," he started. "The 2019 Petit Verdot you opened a second pour of without asking," I said. "Retails for $220, as I mentioned. We produced 340 cases that year. They sold out in 11 days. Preston opened his mouth, closed it. "The staff you tried to wave over to fix the fence this morning, those are my employees. The maintenance they do is at my direction, on my property. Glenn has worked here for 11 years. I'd appreciate it if you didn't wave at him like he's a service function. Ray, Preston's voice had changed entirely, the performance of authority gone, something underneath it that might have been shame, or might have just been recalculation. I had no idea. Obviously, if you'd known I owned this, you would have spoken to me differently, I said. I understand that. But I want you to sit with the fact that the reason you need to know what someone owns before you decide how to treat them. That's not a small thing, Preston. That's the whole thing. Claire made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I turned to her. I should have shown you all of this sooner. That's on me. Your mother wanted to do this together, and after she was gone, I kept waiting for a better time. There wasn't going to be a better time. This is the time. She crossed the terrace and held on to me the way she hadn't since she was a little girl, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 2 years. Preston stood at the railing. He wasn't a villain in that moment. He looked like a man who'd been handed a mirror and didn't love what he saw, which is its own kind of reckoning. We stayed on the terrace until the stars came up. Preston was quiet for most of it, which was the first genuinely comfortable silence he produced all weekend. At one point he said he owed me an apology, and he said it simply, without the salesman's frame he usually put around everything. I told him I accepted it, and I meant it, conditionally. Some things you accept, and then watch to see what comes after. Before they left Sunday morning, Claire walked with me down to the second row of the Chardonnay block. I told her about Patricia's ashes. She already suspected it. She'd noticed me looking that direction too many times at dusk. She stood there for a while, and I stood with her, and neither of us needed to say anything. Preston loaded their bags into the BMW. He shook my hand at the gate. Not the quick grip of the weekend, but something that held for a moment longer. I didn't understand what you'd built, he said. I should have asked instead of assumed, I said. You can still ask. He nodded. I watched them drive out past the stone pillars at the entrance, past the sign Hollow Creek Vineyard Estuaries 1994, and down the county road between the Gold Hills. I walked back to the barn, checked the fence repair I'd done Saturday morning, found it holding clean. I stood in the morning light for a while, listening to the sound the wind makes when it comes through the vines in October. A dry, papery rustling. The sound of a good year almost over. Patricia had loved that sound. I loved it too. The land doesn't know what anyone thinks of it. It just keeps producing, season after season, faithful to the work you put into it. I had learned that from my father and from his father before him. It was still true. I've been thinking about that October weekend a lot since it happened. Not the big moment on the terrace, though that was real enough, but the small ones. Preston waving at Glenn like he was flagging down a cab. The way he poured himself a second glass without asking, the moment the wine reclassified itself in his mind as worth his attention, Claire going quiet in that particular way. These are the details that stay with you because they're where the truth actually lives. What I've come to understand is that what Preston did wasn't unusual. It wasn't even especially cruel. It was just the natural result of a man who had never been asked to examine the measuring stick he used on other people. He looked at my truck, my flannel, my hands in the dirt, and he ran the numbers the way he'd been taught to run them. The answer he got back told him I was one kind of man. He acted accordingly. That's not a mystery. That's just what happens when a person substitutes assumption for curiosity and calls it intelligence. The harder thing to sit with is Claire. Not her silence on the terrace. I understood that. She was caught between two people she loved, in a dynamic that had been building for years, and she hadn't yet found the words or the courage to interrupt it. What I had to reckon with was my own part in it. I had kept her at a distance from the full truth of what I'd built, first out of a kind of old-fashioned humility, then out of grief, then out of habit. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. But the right moment was any morning I picked up the phone. Patricia knew that. She'd been nudging me toward it for years, gently, the way she nudged me toward most things I was slow to do. There's a kind of strength that gets mistaken for stubbornness. The refusal to explain yourself, to justify your choices, to hand anyone a ledger they didn't earn the right to read. I believed in that for a long time. I still believe in a version of it, but I've learned that protecting your dignity and protecting your relationships are not always the same project. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is let the people you love see what you've built and what it cost you. The work itself, 30 years of it, the early mornings, the bad harvests, the years when the numbers were frightening, the slow decisions that turned out to be right, that work had a character of its own. It required me to keep showing up when showing up was hard, to learn things I didn't know, to stay honest about what the land needed rather than what I wished it would do. That kind of sustained effort over decades doesn't leave you unchanged. It asks something of you every year. What it gave back was not just a business, it was a way of knowing myself that no one could revise based on what I was wearing. Preston stood at that railing and saw for the first time a man he hadn't bothered to look at. I don't carry bitterness about that, but I do think about what it would have cost him nothing to do differently, to ask, to listen, to hold his conclusions loosely. That's not weakness. That's the thing that actually makes a person someone worth knowing. The fence I repaired that Saturday morning is still holding. I checked it again last week. Some things done right simply hold.